Media affects different people in different ways. I've always believed that what you get out of something is shaped by what you bring in. Sometimes that means you'll instantly understand the ideas a creator is trying to get across. Other times, you'll miss what they were going for entirely. But sometimes, you'll connect with something that was never intended to be there at all. Wolf Children was directed by Mamoru Hosoda with a screenplay by Hosoda and Sakoto Okudera. Released in 2012, the story follows a woman named Hana who falls in love with a werewolf and her struggles after his sudden death to raise their two children, Yuki and Ame, who share their father's ability to turn into a wolf by herself. When I first watched this movie, I didn't really understand why it connected with me so deeply. I mean, I liked it, I think it's great, but it always seemed like there was something more, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about how my experiences growing up affect the way I see things, and it was with that mindset that I came back to this movie. Everything was the same as before. I liked the same things. I loved the beauty of it all. But besides that, I think I saw something else. A reading of the movie that connected with me in a much more personal way than I was expecting. But it's also a reading that I don't think was intended to be there. This one is gonna get a bit more personal, so I hope you don't mind. The story is deceptively simple. For all the fantasy and whimsy a movie about raising werewolves would seem to have, it's about as quiet and intimate as you can get. There are no real villains here, no force that needs to be defeated, nothing that grand. Wolf Children is focused on Hana, her family, and their struggles trying to live in a new place. And one of the things I really appreciate about how Hosoda and Okudera approach this setup is that the new place they move to is pretty welcoming and relaxed. Even the grumpy old man, who seems like someone who would cause a lot of hardship, warms up to them quickly and helps them out. He's grumpy because that's just how he is, I guess. It's also a beautiful place. The movie as a whole is gorgeous. Even with all the hardship, Wolf Children is able to create a relaxed and laid-back environment that makes me want to pack up all my stuff and move to a quiet little place outside the city. If I had the guts or money to do that sort of thing. I think it's kind of funny that for a while, Hana was the template girl for all those lo-fi hip-hop channels on YouTube back when they started to get popular, which is fitting considering how this movie feels. The story isn't all that focused on the struggle of keeping Yuki and Ame's abilities a secret either. That's part of it, kinda, and there are some cute moments that come from that, but it's not the thing that really drives the story. Like I said, the movie is quiet and intimate. Very broadly, it's about family, nature, and belonging, but if I had to boil all of those elements down, I'd say that this movie is mostly about transitions, the space between spaces. Throughout the movie, Hana exists in a state of transition, from an individual to part of a family, from a partner to a widow, from a city girl to a country bumpkin. We watch as she slowly moves from one space to the next and how uncertain things are in between. I've heard that raising children can sometimes feel like raising a wild animal, and the movie just takes that in the most literal direction. And while it's cute to see the absolute chaos children can be depicted so playfully as Yuki and Ame actually turn into wolves, that direction also exemplifies a lot of the insecurities of being a first-time parent, a single one at that. Hana has no idea how to properly raise her children, and because Yuki and Ame are so different from herself, the movie focuses on Hana slowly learning everything she can to care for them. But even then, how can she know what's best for them when they are so unlike herself? It's an insecurity she has to fight off every single day. And this struggle for Hana happens all on top of her moving and learning to live in the countryside. As someone who grew up in the city, she basically has to learn a new lifestyle from scratch. How to tend to crops, what kind of plants to grow. She even takes a job that barely pays just to get by. To learn a completely different culture from what you knew before is one of the biggest changes someone can go through. And Hana does all of that for the sake of Yuki and Ame, so that they could have a better life. That's a powerful story by itself, the lengths we can go to for people we love. But that's only half of the story. Yuki and Ame's journey is the other half, and their path from childhood to adolescence continues this idea of transitions and changes. It's common for stories to be metaphors for our own experiences, and that's exactly what Wolf Children does. The entire point of de-emphasizing the fantastical elements of Yuki and Ame's abilities is so that people can place whatever struggles they faced growing up onto them. It's not a secret that this this is what Hosoda and Okudera intended with these characters. And Yuki and Ame's struggles with their powers can really be a stand-in for anything that made us feel isolated and alone. Whether that be feelings of inferiority because we weren't like everyone else, the hardship of trying to belong because of moving to a new place, or maybe coming to terms with an aspect of ourselves that we didn't accept and weren't ready to share. The feeling and fear of being an outsider is what drives Yuki and Ame, and their struggles as they grow and change into young adults, eventually accepting themselves for who they are, is cathartic. It's a story that I think a lot of people can relate to. But for me, the movie touches on a struggle that's deeply personal. That's sort of a byproduct of how this story was set up. The isolation Yuki and Ame feel growing up is nuanced, because what isolates them from everyone isn't really their powers. It's their experience. As much as Hana loves her children, she can't relate to the things they're going through. Even though Hana tries to comfort and guide her children the best she can, she has no idea what their struggles are and what it feels like to grow up with their powers. Yuki and Ame can't completely relate to their classmates either, because their experience of the world is entirely different because of how they were raised. The things Yuki and Ame think are normal and common just aren't for everyone else. And at an age when all you want is to fit in with everyone and be understood, that can be scary. But the movie also isolates them in one more way, and this is where things get more interesting to me. Yuki and Ame both have powers that they don't fully understand. And what I find interesting is that the focus isn't really on learning to control that power. It's not presented as something that needs to be embraced to be accepted by everyone. And the movie doesn't introduce a problem that can only be solved by being a werewolf. That power is just something that shaped the people Yuki and Ame are. And the movie isolates them with that power by removing any connection they have to it, because the only person who could tell them about that power, where it comes from, and what it means is gone. This is the part that really put things into perspective for me. What really made me understand my connection to the struggle Yuki, Ame, Hana, and their family as a whole face. I see Wolf Children as a story about transitions and changes. Hana moves out to the countryside for the sake of her kids, learning a completely new way of life and taking a job that barely pays just to get by. Her kids grow up in this new world, which is basically all they've known, struggling to fit in because of an aspect of themselves that makes them experience the world in a completely different way than their peers. And yet, it's a part of them that they don't understand and can't fully connect to. That struggle hits close to home because that's what it felt like growing up for me. I was born in the United States, but my parents weren't. They immigrated here a few years before my brother and I were born, and that perspective completely changes the way I view this movie. I don't know what it's like to be a parent who raises their children in a place that's new and foreign. The kinds of struggles someone in that position would face, all the things they would need to learn to get by. But I'd imagine that what Hana goes through is similar to what my parents had to go through. Seeing how difficult that is, the hard work it takes to learn a completely new way of life, the insecurity of not knowing what to do, and the hardship of not being able to completely connect to your child's struggles makes me really appreciate what my parents did for me and my brother when we were little all the more. What I do know though is what it feels like to grow up as the son of immigrants, and the movie has a lot of moments that touch on that struggle, intentional or not. Yuki scaring off her classmates because of a snake she's found and tries to show off, or because of her box of treasures. That's something that I think a lot of people in my position can relate to, especially when your family comes from a place with a completely different culture. People with that background often talk about the times when classmates comment on how weird the food they eat is, or that they eat it in a strange way, and that's happened to me to some extent. That moment is so common for us second-generation kids that I think it's kind of a cliche to talk about. But those scenes with Yuki are exactly that moment. And I think moments like that stick out to a lot of us because just like Yuki, it's the first time that we realize that our background makes our experience of the world different from the people around us. Something we thought was normal and common wasn't. And what I love about how the movie portrays this moment is that ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Yuki wasn't made fun of because of it. I was lucky enough to have grown up in a place where things like this weren't a big deal, which I know isn't always true. But I think the movie does a good job of exploring why moments like this can still affect someone like Yuki even absent any ridicule. It's an insecurity born from a fear of being different and alone. People can't relate to how she sees things, how she feels, and for a child, that's terrifying. But here's what makes this movie feel oddly specific to me. Yuki and Ame don't know all that much about their wolf side, despite how much it shaped their lives. They are unable to connect to a vital aspect of who they are because they don't understand it themselves. For me, that struggle took the form of something that can sometimes happen to the kids of immigrants: the struggle of not being bilingual. My parents came from a country that spoke English and their national language, so they knew both. But growing up, most people around me spoke English, even my parents did. And when they did speak to me in another language at home, I mostly responded back in English for no other reason than it was easier. So while I learned how to understand that language somewhat, I never learned how to speak it. What that means is sometimes I can't connect to a lot of my family, the parts that can't speak English, and I can't connect to their culture, even though it's influenced my life in a lot of ways. I didn't know enough to relate to the experiences of some of my relatives, but I did know just enough so that some of my friends and classmates couldn't relate to me either. When I was little, I remember being unable to explain to them why exactly it was rude if I called my brother by his first name alone, something that still feels weird to do to this day, all because I didn't understand the language and culture where that custom came from. Just like Ame, I had to go out of my way to learn these things, which was a long and difficult process to go through, and even then, the insecurities were still there. When Yuki is told she smells like fur, something that again wasn't supposed to be mean or malicious, it still made her feel isolated because it was just another reminder of how different she was from everyone else. Even after all those years, Yuki and Ame mirror the two sides of myself growing up, trying to fit in with people who didn't experience the world like I did, and trying to understand a part of myself that I didn't really know anything about. That struggle was hard to communicate and explain to others. My friends couldn't fully understand, and my parents, as much as they loved and supported me, couldn't relate. The struggle of being born between worlds and not really feeling like you belong to either. And the solution to that struggle is different for everyone who grows up this way. I think it's great that Yuki and Ame end up on different paths, each deciding for themselves what they want to do with their lives, both fulfilled by the choice they make. There are a lot of ways you can look at and connect to the story of wolf children. It's about a single mother trying to get by for the sake of her kids. It's about the tension between humans and nature. It's about outcasts trying to fit in and accept themselves. But for me, it's a story about changes and the transition from one generation to the next. The story of a family that moves to a new place for a better life, and a story about children who were born between worlds, trying to understand their place within both. I don't expect a lot of people to see the same things I do in this movie, and I also can't speak for everyone who grew up like me. I'm just one person. I looked around though to see if there was anyone who saw what I did, and there was at least one other person that did, which was comforting. I know that I can only read the movie like this because of my experience, and that it probably wasn't intended. Japan isn't really known for immigration, and I can't imagine that Hosoda or Okudera, both born and raised in Japan, had the struggles of children born to immigrants in mind when writing the story. But does that intent really matter? Hosoda wanted people to see their own families reflected in this movie, all the struggles that come with raising a new generation. And even though it isn't a perfect metaphor, the movie still manages to capture the experiences of mine. There is something beautiful about having a story speak to a struggle that's so personal. And there's a power in having something to point to and say, this is what it feels like. It might help others who don't know what it's like understand that struggle and empathize. And for me, it means having something that expresses a struggle I could never really explain. Looking back, it makes me wish I could tell my younger self that I wasn't the only one who felt that way, and that there were even more people who went through the same things regardless of the reason. The scariest thing for me back then was thinking that people couldn't understand the things I was going through. And I wish I knew that even though it felt like I was born between worlds, I was never alone. Thank you so much for watching. As you can tell, this was a pretty personal topic. I don't expect this video to do as well as the last one, but that's fine. My Twitter has a playlist with all the extra stuff, so check that out if you want. This is something I don't really like talking about, but the channel recently crossed 30,000 subscribers, which is surreal. There's not much else for me to say other than thank you for all the support.